Bill, it's such a pleasure to have you. Thank you so much for joining me.
Pleasure, pleasure. I, I'm back 10 minutes and not even time for a coffee from my last visit, but it was a
Oh,
good visit. So,
well, if you want, we can pause this recording and start over so you can get a coffee.
oh no, I'm still awake.
You're still awake. You're still doing okay. What time is it over where you are?
It's 10 minutes past 5.
Okay. Well, you should be having wine, not coffee, but that's a conversation for another day. All right, well, let's dive in. So before we get talking about Burgundy, I'm very excited
Uh-huh.
about this episode, and I'm sure all our listeners are too. But let's just talk about you for a moment. So tell us who you are and what your connection is to wine and to Burgundy itself.
That's a very small question to start with. Bill Nanson, um, just coming up on a very big birthday. I'm from what is actually a very good vintage in Burgundy, 1962.
Mm.
So that's the clue. Um, I'm originally from the UK. I worked for a short time in London, and when I was working there, I had the opportunity very occasionally to visit Burgundy. I was already sort of like an equal opportunities drinker. I tried everything before slowly, finding I kind of like this stuff. Uh, and so I got the chance to visit in Burgundy, maybe a little bit more than once a year, not quite twice a year, for a few years. And then I was working in the chemical industry, and I got a job. I changed jobs, and I started working for a Swiss company out of Basel, which is top left-hand corner of Switzerland, and only 2.5 hours from Burgundy. So instead of coming here once a year, I say here because I'm sitting in my apartment in Beaune right now. I still live in Switzerland though. And so I started visiting Burgundy once, a little bit more often, let's say twice a year, 3 times a year, 4 times a year. Then since 2004, every year I've done the harvest here. I don't always get so wet as a lot of the people because I do most of my work actually in the winery. So and there's wine on tap in the winery too. So as refreshment, everybody else goes to the beer at the end of the day. I just go to the spigot and I'll take the Merceau.
Quality
Oh,
checking, right?
exactly, exactly. So I've been coming here for quite a few years. The first vintage that I ever tasted from barrel were the 1996s in 1997, and that was in the Côte, well, not the Côte Chalonnaise, in the Mâconnais. So it was the village of Chardonnay, where maybe the name of the grape came from. There's some
Mm.
discussion about who came first. And really, in terms of my online presence, which is called Burgundy Report, I started that about 2002. And really, I was, I suppose, voraciously reading everything that I could find about Burgundy, and was still left with some questions. And so, in the end, I couldn't find answers to some of those questions. So I thought to myself, hmm, maybe I can find out myself. And so the website Burgundy Report, it basically started with just a few visits that I made, trying to find answers to certain questions that I had, and seemingly it wasn't just my mother and a few dogs and cats that started visiting the sites. The traffic started going up, which was, today I got 10 people. I don't know where they came from, but I got 10 people.
Well, if
So
it's a 50% increase, that's not bad.
exactly, exactly. And for years and years now, it's been quite stable for a number of years, but I get between 1,000 and 2,000 people visiting the site per day. And when I release a new report, I think the maximum I ever had was close to 11,000 in one day.
Wow.
So somebody is also interested or completely lost on the internet. Who knows? Uh, so I started doing it really as a hobby. It was sort of like my escape from the office, from my day job, if I can say that. And then over a period of time, the audience grew. I had the I was commissioned to write a book by the magazine The World of Fine Wine. It was at that time. They had a series of books. They foolishly chose me to write their Burgundy book, which turned out to be their best-selling book in the whole series. Had a couple of reprints in the US, in Europe, and was even printed in Japanese. I have a copy in Japanese.
Wow.
There are a couple of Japanese winemakers here in Burgundy that tell me, Bill, this is incorrect. And I just say, sorry, I didn't translate it. The original text was correct. So, and then a couple of years later came the change of contract that I could decline for the chemical company. And I just thought to myself, why not? So I turned full time. I started taking subscribers for monthly reports, but 95% of the whole site remains open for everyone because everything that's more than 2 years old is open to everyone. You know, the subscribers pay for the new stuff, but new is classified as about just over 2 years. And so I basically said, no, I think I'll do something different. And so I changed to full-time writing in 2013. I've just about come to the end of my 10th year, and I'm still alive. So it worked. So that's me. That's my connection to the wine. And I'm in France just close to 50%. I would say just for fiscal reasons, just a little under 50%, but I got an apartment here and I never left Switzerland. I love Switzerland. I love the mountains. And so I commute at weekends. So a busy month for me would be 3 weeks in the month here in Burgundy, but then I go back for the weekends. So it's still only like 12 nights in a busy month that I'm here in France. So it's still less than 50%. So, and I try to keep my finger on the pulse of what's happening here, the news, the styles, the new producers, the styles of the different vintages. We're just really starting to taste the new vintage now, 2021. It's a more classic vintage after quite a number of warmer, drier years. We've come to something that reflects a little bit more the early 2000s, or in some cases even the wines of the 1980s, 1990s, but still with quite some nice maturity to it. So it's always interesting.
Yeah. Well, that leads nicely to the next question, which is to just level set about Burgundy for us. So on your website, and yes, I did have a look at your website. And by the way, I do have to say, I've read your book and your book is fabulous. So for anyone listening,
so
you're the one. Burgundy. Yeah, I'm the one. And many of my minions are always logging into your website to get that number up. No, it's a fantastic book. And I think you really captured Burgundy well. And it's so great to see the profiles on the producers. That's such a great way to learn about it, right? Because they're so distinct.
A lot of them, like me, have less hair now because it's 10 years older book.
Well, let's not update the photos. You know, the way that I always felt bad for the queen that we were updating the photos on the dollar bills for her. May she rest in peace. But all right. So Burgundy, let's level set. On your website, you say that Burgundy is like an onion. What do you mean by that?
I think I stole that from the film Shrek.
Yes.
When Shrek says, you know, I forget the subject that he had, but you said something was like an onion, you know.
Ogres.
It has so many layers. And donkeys by the side of him. Layers? Who needs onion? Cakes have layers. So no, the thing about Burgundy is it's a subject that you can really, really describe as open-ended. You know, nobody knows all the rules off by heart, or all the vineyards off by heart, and certainly not all the growers off by heart, because in the Burgundy region, you've got about 4,000 people making wine, Chablis to Côte Chalonnaise, further south, even to the Mâconnais. And then what I write about and visit is I call Greater Burgundy. So I start up in Chablis, the Côte d'Ozère, this region, but I go as far south as Beaujolais. So for me, that's part of Greater Burgundy. And you can find more thousands of producers even in the Beaujolais region. So when I started over 20 years ago, sounds a lot now, doesn't it? Over 25 years ago, probably you would count the number of really consistently good domains in, well, more than dozens, but maybe not 100 domains. I would say today, due to a number of factors, the more benevolent weather, the higher price, meaning people can actually invest more money into their cuvées, into their equipment, their temperature control, their grape sorting, all these various facets. I would say that in terms of reliable, very good producers, today we can easily say hundreds of domains, and nobody has the bandwidth or the available time to visit many hundreds of domains. I personally, it's enough for me in the time that I have available. I visit about 350 to 400 domains per year.
Wow.
And that's all Greater Burgundy. So from Chablis to Beaujolais. And within that number, I would say that I visit about 60, 70% the same domains each year, because for me it's important to have my benchmarks to actually be able to position the new vintages. You know, how did this domain do compared to other vintages? Is that consistent with other domains? And then you can sort of, in a way, slightly pigeonhole the new places that you visit, or the places that maybe I visit every 2, 3, or 4 years. So it's the onions, it's all the layers. You've got no chance to know everything. All you can do is hope that you can make a nice snapshot of where the place is today, I would say. But it's about the rules, the traditions, the families, the processes, and of course, ultimately, often the weather. So every year it's different.
Yeah. Well, that's a great description. So let's actually dive into one of those. Let's start with
Okay.
just some practical information for some people who may not be familiar with this. First, walk us through the main varietals of Burgundy, and you can talk about the greater Burgundy area because obviously we have some new introductions in Beaujolais. But then also, can you just give us a quick 101 of the classification system and how the vineyards are defined and the quality levels? Because that's always a bit confusing, I think.
Well, let's start with the grapes. You can be 95% correct if you simply say, for Greater Burgundy, in white, it's Chardonnay, and in red, it's Pinot Noir or Gamay. Gamay exclusively in the Beaujolais, although I say exclusively, you know, the whole place is about the exceptions. That's the beauty of Burgundy. It's like this, but and so the but in Beaujolais would be that some people are now starting to actually plant a little bit of Syrah or Shiraz in some of the south. Also, they're starting to plant a little bit of Pinot Noir. And Beaujolais also, that there is some Chardonnay. There's, I think it's about 3% of the total plantings now. Everyone seems to want a Beaujolais Blanc, a white Beaujolais these days, but the good ones are quite rare, I have to say. For someone who really enjoys Chablis and the great wines of the Côte d'Or, the great white wines of the Côte d'Or, great Beaujolais is a very rare thing. White Beaujolais. So those three varieties, Chardonnay, Pinot, and Gamay. In general, there's more white wine produced than red wine. And that difference is slowly growing, I would say, for a couple of reasons. You know, in the end, all the growers, they're farmers. And the thing about the rules is, in a particular area, you're allowed higher yields for Chardonnay than Pinot Noir. The wine itself can tolerate a higher yield and still be interesting if you're making wine from Chardonnay than Pinot Noir. Once you get above a certain yield in Pinot Noir, it starts to become a little bit dilute and uninteresting. But it does that much sooner than Chardonnay. So you're allowed to make more in a given area. Plus, at least, certainly here in the Côte d'Or, most of the growers, they'll get a few euros more per bottle for a white wine than they will for a red wine. So it's a double win. So some places like the Hill of Corton in the Côte d'Or, places which were historically producing red wine are slowly turning white. And a very simple example would be Chassaing-Montrachet, the village in the south of the Côte d'Or. Historically, 50 years ago, it would have been about 75% red wine that was produced there. Today, it's less than 50% red wine that's produced there.
Wow.
And here they call it the whitening of the hillsides. And it's for those simple reasons, more yield allowed, higher price for the whites, it's a double win. Why wouldn't they, when the vineyard needs replanting, replant with white? So essentially, that's the grapes. There's another one that people might hear about more often, and it's still, at least in the Côte d'Or, a reasonable percentage of the total. I think it's almost 7% of the whites today, and that's the Aligoté grape. Historically, I say over 100 years ago, it was an important grape. But then there was the phylloxera crisis where the bugs started eating the vines in the late 1800s and basically decimated wine production, not just in Burgundy or France, but globally. When they found a solution for replanting the vineyards, people decided that it was higher quality to go for Pinot Noir or Chardonnay. So a lot of the Aligoté wasn't replanted. So today Aligoté tends to be planted in the less optimal places, and because of that, it garnered a reputation of something that for cheap drinking, easy wines, and became the wine of choice for the drink Kir, where it's mixed with cassis, or Kir Royal, where it's mixed with some bubbles. Here, of course, Crémant de Bourgogne. So people might hear about Aligoté, but the 95% rule, it's Chardonnay, it's Pinot Noir, and it's Gamay in the greater Burgundy area. So that's the grapes. In terms of the classifications, Chablis to the north, and the Côte d'Or, and the Mâconnais, and the Côte Chalonnais. I did that back to front because heading north to south, actually, the Côte Chalonnais comes before the Mâconnais. It's pretty much the same classification the whole time. You start off with regional wines, the base of the classification, and that will be roughly 50% of all the wine that's produced in Greater Burgundy. And by regional, I mean Bourgogne. So Bourgogne Rouge or Bourgogne Blanc, white Burgundy, red Burgundy. The next level up will be the village level wine. And that's where a wine can take the name of where it's produced, the area that it's produced in. So that could be Chablis in the north, or in the Côte d'Or, it could be Gevrey-Chambertin, or in the Côte de Beaune, it could be Beaune, or it could be Meursault. So that's level 2. And there are 4 levels. So you can imagine that, for instance, in Gevrey-Chambertin, you've got the village, you've got the regional wine, the Bourgogne, you've got the village wine, Gevrey-Chambertin. But within Gevrey-Chambertin, there are some extra good places where the level of wine is higher. It's got more of everything. And these tend to be the premier cru places. You have those in Chablis, you have those in the Côte d'Or, you have those in the Côte Chalonnaise, and new in 2020, you now have some of those also in the Mâconnais. Pouilly-Fuissé for
Mhm.
the first time in 2020 had some Premier Cruise. So that's the first time in that region. Um, and then if you can imagine that there are these special places that are allowed Premier Cruise, then in some villages there are even more special places, and these are the Grand Crus. And you have those again in Chablis, you have those again in the Côte d'Or, but you don't have any of those in the Mâconnais or the Côte Chalonnais. Um, that's, if you like, the northern Burgundy perspective. In the south of Burgundy, which is what I call Beaujolais, where it's basically, apart from a little bit of white Beaujolais, it's slightly different only because you have almost the equivalent of, well, how can I put it? I would say 3 levels of classification. You've got Beaujolais, which is the base, ridiculously cheap wine because it's not easy to sell, despite some really good quality makers. The bottles can start at €5 or €6 from the domains. And it's simply not possible these days for a domain to work conscientiously, organically, and do everything to the maximum and sell a wine for €5. The bottle and the cork and the label probably cost 3 of those euros. But there you have Beaujolais. The next level up would be Beaujolais Village, and then the top would be almost like a Premier Cru, you could say, but in terms of the naming, it's more like the village wines in the rest of Burgundy. So it's Beaujolais with the name of its village attached to it. So that will be effectively, you're buying the village, you're buying a Morgon, or you're buying a Moulin à Vente, or a Saint-Amour, or a Fleury, or a Juliana. So depending on who's speaking, there's 8, 9, or 10 of these, because some people are pushing harder at their area. We should really be considered as a Beaujolais Cru too. So these are the Beaujolais Crus. They don't say Premier Cru, but because it's like the third level in Beaujolais, you could almost think of it like a Premier Cru. And they say it's a Beaujolais Cru, but effectively you're buying the village, a Moulin à Vent, a Saint-Amour, a Brouilly, for instance, or a Côte de Brouilly. So quite a rambling response, but because it's such a big subject. But effectively, most of it is very similar with the 4 levels, regional to Grand Cru, but not all of the areas have Grand Crus. And just 3 levels in the Beaujolais, but it's analogous. Beaujolais Village, and Beaujolais Cru. I'll just put it like that.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. I mean, I think the important thing to know about the classification, the reason I think it's important to go through is that Burgundy, unlike Bordeaux, where the classifications are attached, of course, to the chateau, in Burgundy, it's attached to the land. So it's a different model.
It's exactly that. We talk a lot about the grapes, but really what's important in Burgundy is not the what, it's the where. And I love when I've got some visitors here, I love to take them to a little area where I normally park, and it's next to, well, it's in the middle of the Grand Crus in effectively just in Chassagne-Montrachet, the white Grand Crus, but the top ones, you can simply point above you here, Chevalier Montrachet, starting price, or no, let's say average price, €500 a bottle. Right in front of us, Montrachet, average price, €800 a bottle. Just lower down on the slope, Bâtard Montrachet, average price, €300 a bottle. Just beyond that, there's no Premier Cru. It starts directly to Village Wine, average price, €50 a bottle. But here where we're parked, there's a clearing, there's some brush, there are no vines, And you can imagine over generations if they could have made the equivalent of 40 euros per bottle, having vines in this place, sitting directly next to the most expensive white wine there is in Burgundy, it would have been planted, but it doesn't support the vines. So you can say 500 euros, 800 euros, 300 euros, 40 euros, not worth planting. And in essence, that's Burgundy. It's terroir.
Amazing.
It's the basis of everything that there is here. And so, even a young vine Montrachet is going to cost you about 750 a bottle compared to 100-year-old vines in a Bourgogne Rouge that maybe, if it's still a very good producer, might cost you 20. So it's essentially about the place in Burgundy. And behind that, it's not just a geologist saying, oh, here we've got the different levels of rock from this era, or it's basically the experience of 700, 800, in some places over 1,000 years, generations of often the same families tasting the wine from vines that they planted, and 9 times out of 10 always coming up with a very similar hierarchy. This one is always better than this one. Sometimes this one is just as good, but half the time it's not as good. And slowly the hierarchy builds. And, it's easy to dismiss for people that don't get the chance to come and taste at domains. It's easy to dismiss the fact it can't be that the village wine is always better than the regional wine, the Bourgogne, or that the Premier Cru is always better than the village wine, or the Grand Cru is always better than the Premier Cru wine. But, it's absolutely fascinating that normally it is. And it's the exceptions that really have you reaching for your pen and asking the question, but why? Is it young vines? Did they have a problem here? Or was there a problem in the winery when they were making the wine? You've searched, it's so ingrained in tasting experience over years and years that it really prompts the questions, why is this not as good? And so that's the fascinating part here. It's easily dismissed, but if you do it and if you visit a lot, wow, yeah, you can really say, wow, why is that?
Yeah, that is fascinating. And I think that Burgundy has such an advantage in a sense with that long history, having gone through that process completely organically, right? Identifying not just the acres, but the rows that maybe produce a different cuvee.
Exactly
And
that.
other regions are still figuring out which grape even grows on their soil at the
Exactly.
best.
Because I love some of the interpretations of Pinot Noir that come from New Zealand, for instance, because, it's one of the few places in what people like to call the New World that really has a comparable acidity and energy that you can find in Pinot Noir from here. And what's fascinating is, they've got almost no plots of vines that are older than about 30 years old. So within 30 years, they're already making some seriously impressive wines. Just imagine what they'd be doing if they already had, instead of 30 years, 300 or 500 years of experience that, with all the various plots and things like that. So you could say the wines from New Zealand are incredibly good for the level of experience that they have. It's part of the fascination of this place. Records go back over 1,300 years, in some cases over 1,500 years, that, there were vines here at that time. So not always Pinot Noir, not always Chardonnay, who knows what was planted. But, again, it comes back to the hierarchy of the land. which land was considered the more prestigious. And
Well, it's amazing, as you say, that there's some truth there. So I
Mhm.
do want to shift into doing a bit of a tour since
Okay.
you do some tours. So let's do a tour of Burgundy just at a high
Uh-huh.
level. But before we get to that, I'll ask you to set that up in a moment. But can you just give us a sense of what it feels like, right? Burgundy has this reputation of being a place of growers, people connected to the land. Whereas in Bordeaux, I think people sometimes unfairly say that, it's these glitzy chateaus and it has sort of the glam feel to it, almost like Napa. Whereas Burgundy, it's unassuming, it's about the land, it's about the dirt. What does it actually feel like when you arrive in Beaune, or when you arrive at one of these estates that's maybe fetching, like you say, $800 a bottle, but it still somehow
Mhm.
has a different feel? What's the overall feel?
Um, I think back to over 25 years ago when I first started to come here. Well, the first impression, of course, is Beaune itself. It's a lovely walled. 60% of the walls are still in place. A lovely walled medieval town. And once it did have a moat all the way around to protect from the people who wanted to steal the wine in their cellars or who knows what. So that's the first thing. When you get out into the vineyards, I think it's fair to say that there are more picturesque areas, vineyard areas, south of Burgundy, the central part of Burgundy, I would say, in the Mâconnais around Vergisson and the Rock of Solutre. Oh, wow, that's some of the seriously most impressive vineyards in Burgundy, I would say. But when I remember my first experiences coming into domains, I was quite selective at the start. I only chose the ones that spoke English. And I just found people that were so matter of fact and so, I would say, welcoming to someone who wanted to learn a lot but didn't know a lot. And you'd ask a question and they'd simply scratch their heads and say, well, let's see then. And they'd disappear and they'd come back with a different bottle from 10 years old or 15 years old or 30 years old even. That was my introduction to Burgundy. Everything was so easy. I think it's fair to say in the intervening time, prices have hit hyperspace for a lot of the wines here in Burgundy. I would say really in the last 15, since about the 2005 vintage. We all complained about the price increases in 2005. But if you look today at those prices, you would think, oh, I wish I could buy at those prices again. And there's a different generation that largely that's come through in 20 years. It's slightly different. It's less easy to get the appointments today than was once the case. And it's no surprise. I remember more than 15 years ago, someone telling me that a domain like Domaine de la Romani Conti, on everyone's bucket list to visit, I would say probably. Um, more than 15 years ago, they were getting over 250 requests per week for visits.
Wow.
It's just not possible. And who knows how many today? I should ask the question. I don't know if they'll answer the question, but I should ask the question. But I ask myself in some respects, how do people start today, to get an idea, to get to be able to position all the wines, to essentially do what I do? How would somebody start today? And it's certainly less easy than was once the case because there's such a focus on Burgundy today that there are so many more people wanting to make the visits and having the ability to make the visits. And time is limited for the producers. So it's also, we can't dismiss the fact now that, okay, it's different before the wines are bottled, but maybe not all the wines are available to taste today like they once were, because this bottle now is oversubscribed 5 times in terms of the clientele who want to buy it. It costs over €500 per bottle. Why would a proprietor open the bottle today for people who are just passing by? Because they also don't have wine to sell. I can compare it almost, some of the smaller domains used to always have wine to sell, but we've had a lot of vintages with quite low yields for the past few years. So, 2018 was the last vintage with a good volume of both red and white wine. And a lot of the vintage since then have been close to half harvests.
Wow.
And some of the domains in 2021, because of frost and bad weather for the first half of last year, they've made a quarter of the wine that they normally make. So there's not enough wine to go around at the moment, which is another of the price drivers at the moment, pushing the price higher. So it's hard to compare now with 20 years ago, but all the people that I meet, and because I've made the connections over many years, if sometimes I visit with some friends, my friends can't get over how easy and how approachable these people are, and what bottles they're prepared to pull out of the cellar. It's almost easier at some domains for them to go pull out a 1985 than it is to pull out a 2017 these days. So all the modern vintages, they're sold. So it's quite interesting from that respect. So very personable people, very easy to get on. I hear things about other regions. In fact, a well-known wine writer once quite recently actually said to me, if he compares with a certain other region that I won't name, he said, the difference with Burgundy is after you visit the producers, you still like the wines.
Oh, that's a good metric of success.
So I won't say who, and I won't say where.
We'll leave it to the imagination. Well, on that, Bill, this is fascinating. I think we could talk about Burgundy all day long. So we're definitely going to have to do additional episodes, but let's dive into a bit of a tour. And tell you what, why don't we leave Chablis and Beaujolais for another day?
Okay.
Let's do a tour of the Côte d'Or, maybe into the Côte Chalonnaise and the Côte and the Mâconnais. And just walk us through from north to south. Tell us maybe a little bit about some of the key villages in each of those areas, and maybe some key producers that you particularly like or should be particularly known, and just any key stylistic facts or anything you think worth noting about those areas as you go through. So let's just go north to south and learn
that's a whole book, isn't it? Really?
It is. I know. We're going to try to do it in like 10, 15 minutes.
Okay. Well, the Côte d'Or, to start off with, it's effectively an east-facing hillside. It's about 40 miles long, about 60 kilometers, and east-facing. It's a hillside that comes down, and then it's flat to the Jura, and on a clear day, even Mont Blanc, 250 kilometers away, you can see. And for me, this east-facing thing is important because, a lot of people say that the name Côte d'Or, basically or in French, it's gold. And so they say, it's the golden slopes. So right now, at this time of year, all the leaves on the vines are slowly changing color, and that color change will be more and more until the leaves fall to the ground in the first frost or the first really heavy rain that comes in the autumn. And so the color is really quite cool. And they say, Côte d'Or, it's the golden color. I've got a slightly different perspective because it doesn't really make sense to me that the Côte d'Or has that name for just 2 weeks per year and not every year, depending on the weather. But if you look at all the old maps from here, I'm talking about maps from 1,000 years ago or 500 years ago, some of the well-preserved maps, almost every map, written at the top, it says Côte d'Orient, the east.
Oh.
So you're looking to the east, and it's this long eastern hillside. There are some little side valleys that here they call combes, but basically, for me, Côte d'Or means the east-facing hillside. So that's the starting point for here, where all the expensive stuff is. And so it basically starts just south of Dijon. It used to start all the way into Dijon because today you've got the Côte de Beaune and the Côte de Nuit, but 100 years ago you also had the Côte de Dijon.
Mm.
Côte de Dijon is 99% lost today because Dijon is a big city and it grew and they needed housing, they needed land to build. So there's a little bit of vineyard land that's still exists, but effectively today we're talking about the Côte de Nuit. And you leave Dijon, you have Marcenay, which is got its village appellation only in the 1980s, but already has the work and what they call the dossier underway, which takes years to get through the authorities. France is famous for their administration. Let me say the quality of their administration as much as the quantity. And so they're already looking to have some premier crus in Marcenay. You slowly head south from Marcenay and you've got Fissin, which has some nice premier crus. I would historically position that a little bit like Pommard in the Côte de Beaune and Nuit Saint-Georges in the Côte de Nuit as wines with a little bit more structure, a little bit more power and tannin. And 100 years ago, these wines were really sought after because of the extra structure and everything. Let's say they were a little bit more robust. They lived for longer. And that was what people were looking for generations ago because the use of sulfur wasn't very well understood. And so wines spoiled. So particularly Pommard, Nuit Saint-Georges, Fissin, it kept really well. So they were well sought after wines. After Fissin heading south, you're coming into Gevrey-Chambertin. As the locals would say, for their Chambertin Grand Cru, the king, they call it. So
They've claimed
already
the title.
Gevrey-Chambertin has got 8 different Grand Crus, or maybe I should have checked. Maybe it's 9. I'll need a piece of paper to write them down and make a quick check, but 8 or 9. And there are only 33 Grand Crus in the whole of Burgundy, and Gevrey already has 8 or 9 of them.
Wow.
So you've got Rouchot-Chambertin, Mazy-Chambertin, you've got Chapelle-Chambertin, you've got Cham-Chambertin, you've got Chambertin-Clos de Bèze, you've got Chambertin, you've got La Trissière-Chambertin, you've got Griot-Chambertin, you've got Mazoyer-Chambertin. Maybe if I haven't missed one, then there are only 8. So as you slowly follow, it's not called the Route des Grands Crus for nothing. If you slowly follow the road through the vines, and this area typically sits on the mid slopes. Depending on the village, in the mid slope, it's the Grand Crus or it's the Premier Crus. It's the best balance between the depth of soil, the orientation to the sun, and the drainability of the site, and of course, whatever rock is underneath there, whatever type of limestone is underneath there. But Gevrey-Chambertin, wow, it's fabulous with its group of Grand Crus there. Directly next to Gevrey-Chambertin, you've got the village of Moray-Saint-Denis. Perhaps less famous than it could be, but I would put that down to the fact it's not the quality of the wines that come from Moray-Saint-Denis. It's that probably its best known vineyards are actually its Grand Crus, because here you've got another probably 5, I think. You've got Clos de la Roche, you've got Clos Saint-Denis, you've got Clos de l'Ombre, you've got Clos de Tare. They like Clos in Moray-Saint-Denis, and you've got just a little bit of Bonmar as well, which is shared with the next village, which is Chambol-Musigny. So for that reason, I would say that Moray-Saint-Denis definitely shouldn't be overlooked, because some of the premier crus are wonderful, but it's just it's just a name that's a little bit less well known because it's got so much actual Grand Cru land again.
And so
Then you're,
stylistically, if I can just interject for Gevrey
yep.
and for Moret, what would you say stylistically? Are they a bit more robust or are they more elegant? I know Chambol, you're probably going to say is a bit more on the elegant side, but for the others?
You know, it lots of people like to say, yes, it combines the earth and power of Gevrey Chambertin with the floral perfume of Chambol. I think that's a little bit too much of a simplification because all the Grand Crus of Maurice Saint Denis are very different. You've got the elegance of Claude de Lambray, you've got the more power of basically its neighbor on the same slope, the same hillside. You've got the more power of Clos d'État. If you compare the first two Grand Crus in the north, you've got Clos de la Roche and Clos Saint-Denis. Clos de la Roche, it's well known for its minerality, its structural shape, but its minerality. You've got Clos Saint-Denis. Very often it's a rounder wine with riper fruit, a wine, let's say, of more comfort, more texture. And then, of course, Bonne, it's a wine of power again. So no surprise that it's the neighbor of Clos d'État in that respect. So the Grand Crus are all completely different, I would say, and north to south. The vines are not the same in the Village and Premier Crus of Maurice Saint Denis either. I think it's too much of a simplification to say it's just a combination of Chambol Musigny and Gevrey Chambertin. It's a place in its own right, but because it's dominated by its Grand Crus, and because very often the Premier Crus are satellites of the Grand Crus, it's hard to say it has just this character. That's the problem with Maurice Saint Denis. Chambol, when you move a little bit to the south, it's a little bit easier. You still got the Bonne that's situated within Chambol Musigny, a little bit whiter soil there in Chambol, maybe a little bit more floral, but you know it's still real Bonne. There's power there in the wine. It's a wine that usually you should age and wait for. But Chambol Musigny itself, you can generalize and say it's a wine that tends to have a more perfumed style than Moret or Gevrey Chambertin. A wine, elegance is sometimes used as a negative, implying there's a little bit less about the wine, but I would say it's a wine of finesse. There's just a little, well-made Chambol has just that slightly different style, a little bit more finesse. But then it's hard to really generalize. Well, it's hard to talk about finesse when you've got almost like the ultimate combination of power and elegance and perfume in, for instance, Musigny. You know, it's a little Burgundy joke. You know, the smaller the name of the wine, normally the more expensive it is. So you got Chambol Musigny, but you know, Musigny. And you know, today you can't really buy Musigny for under about 600, 700, 800 euros a bottle.
Wow.
So it's one of the top wines of Burgundy is Musigny, but it's a wine of power. Maybe Drouhin make a slightly more approachable version, but generally, you know, the biggest owner, Comte Georges de Vaugué. Honestly, I'm still waiting for my 98s, my 99s. 2000 is delicious, but you know, they're wines that you have to really wait for. After Chambol Musigny, you start, okay, officially it's Flagey-Echezeur, but most people roll the area of Flagey-Echezeur into Vaud-Romany because you got, okay, I shouldn't forget Vougeot. Let me not forget Vougeot because, you know, it's got its very small 120 hectares of Grand Cru Vougeot. Complicated vineyard, mainly because, you know, it's so big. It has so many owners. There are close to 90 owners of vines in the clos itself. Everything is properly walled. It's really impressive. Its size is also impressive. And, a lot of these owners also sell grapes at harvest time. So you won't just find 90 labels of Clos Vougeot. You could find 130 or 150 different labels of Clos Vougeot, all from the same vintage. So how's that for Burgundian complexity for you? But what's interesting with Clos Vougeot is, we talk about the place in Burgundy, and just the other side of the main road, the Route Nationale from Clos Vougeot. There's no village, there's no Premier Cru. It's directly Bourgogne Rouge. But anyone who says, the wine made from the bottom of the Clos is never Grand Cru quality, doesn't taste enough. There are great producers in the bottom of the Clos Vougeot. It's some vintages from Faverly, from Jadot, but not just people like that, from Leroy, who also have vines at the bottom. People pay thousands per bottle for a reason. So that was Vougeot. Now we're into Flagier-Chezeux and Vaux Romany. And, again, the important wines are the Grand Crus. You've got Grand Chezeux, which basically is just the other side of the wall of the Clos Vougeot. You've got Chezeux, which is really a big area that goes high up onto the hillside, low down on the hillside. It's in some dips, no two Chezeux are the same. Then you've got a small band of Premier Crus before you hit, boom, oh, now you're talking. Romany Saint-Vivant, Richebourg, Romany Conti. You've got La Grande Rue, and just above Romany Conti, you've got the smallest appellation in France. It's less than 0.9 of a hectare. It's La Romany itself. And it's always impressive how it interlocks with the top of Romany Conti. It's like a little jigsaw. Parts of Romany Conti are slightly higher up the slope than parts of La Romany. So you can imagine some consistency between the two wines here. So this wine is not priced unfairly compared to its better known neighbor, let's put it that way. And then you've got La Grande Rue, you've got La Tache, also quite a big vineyard that goes from the bottom of the slope to really quite high on the slope. And then you're only into the Premier Crus like Malconso, Au-dessous de Malconso.
Those
You're
lesser
heading
known
into
Premier
Nuit
Crus.
Saint-Georges. So I've probably already taken more than 10 minutes, and that's just the Côte de Nuit. Nuit Saint-Georges, two personalities. You've got the personality from the north of the village that takes some of its style references, benchmarks from Vaux Romany itself. It's got a little bit more spice, a little bit more sophistication in terms of texture, whereas the south of Nuit Saint-Georges, and actually you should say that Nuit Saint-Georges is the only place in the Côte d'Or where the vines stop, because the town is wide enough that there's no place where the vines are continuous. All the rest of the Côte d'Or, from village to village, the vines are continuous. Chambol is next to Vougeot, or it's next to Maurice and Denis. But Nuit Saint-Georges, the village cuts the vines. So the vines restart on the south of Nuit Saint-Georges. And this is the area also full of famous names: Les Vaucrins, Les Cailles, Les Prulliers, Les Saint-Georges, the emblematic Premier Cru for Nuit itself. And then you're heading into Prémaux, the small village of Prémaux-Prissé. And so you've got Clos des Forêts, Clos des Corvées, Clos Saint-Marc, Clos des Archilières, Clos de la Maréchale from Freddy Meunier in Chambol, for instance. And here, the southern Nuit, the character, there's no lack of fruit, there's no lack of depth. And for some producers, if you've got the patience to wait 10 years, great wines. I'm such a great fan, for instance, of 15-year-old wines from Patrice Rion or the Domaine de l'Arlot, for instance. But there's a style difference compared to north of Nuit Saint-Georges. They're still Premier Crus, but the style is for a more, let's say, more visible level of tannin. The grain is more present. After 15, 20 years, it's really not something of concern. But, if you're tasting young wines, and most people starting out taste young wines, they note the structure. And unfortunately, going back to discussing Fissin, Pommard, and Nuit Saint-Georges, today that makes those wines less, for want of a better word, fashionable. They're less saleable than the neighbor Romani. So it's no surprise when you visit a producer, they will tell you, oh yes, this one's from the Beaune side. They will tell you. But north and south, two different characters. So effectively, that's the Côte de Nuit.
Fantastic. Okay, well, I don't care about the time. We have to keep going. This is just, you've come alive telling us about, I feel like we're there. So let's go into the Côte de Beaune.
Well, just before you hit the Côte de Beaune, you've got, for me, unfortunately, a slightly anonymous appellation, and it's still village level, but it doesn't have the name of any single village. That's its, if you like, identity crisis. And that's Côte de Nuit village. And the thing about that is, in theory, it still has the same level in the hierarchy as a Nuit Saint-Georges, as a Vaux Romany, or a Gevrey-Chambertin, but it can be from many, many places in the Côte de Nuit. And that's why it's got this relatively anonymous name. And, all the people that get into Burgundy, and I'm no exception, we all just love when we have a bottle in our hand to be able to put our finger on a map from where this has come from. And that's the problem with Côte de Nuit village. You can't really do that. So that's why I say it's got a slight identity crisis. I don't complain about the quality. There are some great producers. For me, possibly the best Côte de Nuit village is called Les Retraits, and that's from a wine producer from Gevrey-Chambertin called Jérôme Galéron. Wow. He uses some stems, and you could just, it's a wine that almost transcends appellation. It's such a fine wine. You have to pay more for it now, more than most other wines with the same name. But he's differentiated a little. He's got a nice label, like stained glass window stuff. You search that bottle, but generally it's an appellation that lacks a bit of identity, if I can put it like that. But anyway, you head south, and effectively you cross into the Côte de Beaune, just north of the village of Ladois-Sérigny. And Ladois is one of the three villages that are administratively responsible for the hill of Corton. So Corton, big Grand Cru area, it's like 130 hectares of red wine, another 70 hectares of white wine, Corton Chalamet. And for many, many years, people have always said, the hill of Corton, it shouldn't all be Grand Cru. And Corton is known, at least red Corton is known almost a little bit like Nuit and Pommard, all these, for its structure. It's a powerful wine. There's no doubt it's got the intensity of the Grand Cru. But it's historically been a structural wine. It's another of the old jokes of Burgundy. In a good year, you should wait 20 years to drink your wine. In a bad year, you need to wait 20 years before you drink the wine. And Corton was one of those wines. But, the modern vernacular of Corton, because of the obvious change of climate that we've had here in Burgundy, it's everything is ripe. You can choose the date of harvest with very little worry. Everything reaches a proper maturity. Corton these days has, for almost 10 years now, certainly since the 2015 vintage, Corton has been the value Grand Cru of Burgundy.
Mm.
red Corton, because you don't need to worry about the accessibility of the wine. You don't need to worry that it's going to be too structured. If anything, it's almost the other extreme. You've got to be careful that you've got something that hasn't become too mature and is already pushing 14, 15 degrees of alcohol, because then it starts to lose a bit of its clarity and its purity. So that's the one issue with Corton these days. But really, it's a wonderful place, and of course, for the Corton Charlemagne, it's the only white Grand Cru in the Côte d'Or that's not shared between Pouligny-Montrachet and Chassagne-Montrachet. So we'll get to those later. But Corton Charlemagne, it's a wine, I would say, of power. It's a wine of minerality and freshness. It doesn't have, for me, I've got to admit, it doesn't always have quite the same Moorishness of the Southern Grand Crus. It's a wine to wait for, but it remains always a structural wine, a wine that impresses, but not always a wine that you think, oh, I'm going to have to open a second bottle.
Mm.
But when you compare the price, it's also less than half the price of the other Grand Crus in the south as well. So, but it's a worthy Grand Cru, and it's one that actually I prefer younger compared to older. Older for me means more than 20 years old. And all white wine from Burgundy, when it's more than 20 years old, starts to have that white chocolate, lanolin, almost truffly type of character, and it's delicious. It's delicious. But for me, I get my kicks with slightly younger Corton Charlemagne, I must say. So then you're into Beaune. Well, I've quickly bypassed. I shouldn't. You've got the next village that's responsible for a part of the hill of Corton is Alox Corton. Lots of red, not very much white. Alox Corton, but of course, the white that you have in Alox Corton is Corton Charlemagne. But you don't find much Premier Cru or Village white wine, is what I'm trying to say. Pernod, also, its main wine is the Corton Charlemagne. You're a little bit heading more to southwest facing, so there's a bit more freshness in Pernod Vergelès. There's a lot of Village white wine in Pernod Vergelès, and it's got a slightly vibrant, almost sort of reductive style to it that's one you can quite often pick out blind. It's really nice, is Pernod Vergelès. It's a slightly more relaxed version of Corton Charlemagne in from some respects. I like that. Then you have a big area of Savigny-les-Beaunes. I mentioned how accessible Corton Charlemagne had become. Savigny-les-Beaunes, long time an area with good value wines, lots of character, plenty of Premier Crus, but certainly an area that blind you could often pick out because it got a slightly herbal green characteristic to the nose, sometimes the flavors too. Again, in the last vintages with higher temperatures, easy maturity. Wow, you wouldn't find that. It's also been a really great place to buy top wine for a good price in the last few vintages, and I don't see that changing short term. 2022 was another great vintage with fine ripeness, and I expect again the Grand Cru value of Burgundy to be Corton, the Village and Premier Cru value to be Savigny-les-Beaunes again. And Savigny also has some lovely white wine, some lovely Premier Cru white wine too, lovely freshness. You cross over, then dividing Savigny from Beaune, you've got the interstate or the autobahn or the autoroute, depending on where you come from, that goes to Paris in the north. And this is today the de facto frontier, the border between Beaune and Savigny-les-Beaunes. Beaune, 3 hillsides, Um, and it's a place with no Grand Crus. Some people say, maybe Les Grèves should have Grand Cru status, Pertuiso, various wines. Uh, but there are enough Premier Crus. There are over 40 Premier Crus in Beaune. You know, it's a big area. It's a source of delicious wine, quite well priced wine as well. Some of the cuvées like the Enfant Jésus from Bouchard Père or Claudie Mouche from Domaine Drouin. They're quite pricey, but you know they're really historic cuvées, almost brands that have been in the market for 100 years. So they've worked on slowly increasing their price, but excellent wines, excellent wines. South of Beaune, now you're already in Pommard. We mentioned that generically people think of Pommard as quite a structured wine. I should say Beaune has quite a bit of white wine as well, quite a bit, let's say 15% or something like that, roughly. Historically, that was quite a rich wine, a generous wine. For my taste, missed a little bit of zing, a little bit of energy. But you know, the market has moved on. The market used to like that style, appreciate that style of wine. Today, the general market appreciates a little bit more energy, a little bit more precision, a little bit more dynamism. And so a lot more Beaune is being made in this style today, white Beaune. But Pommard and its next neighbor to the south, Volnay, it's only red wine. It's only Pinot Noir. You can have a little bit of Gamay in the lower lying areas, but this will be used for Pastougran or Bourgogne Grand Ordinaire. Lots of different labels these days. But I mentioned the strictness, the structure of Pommard, like Nuit Saint-Georges or Fissin, but you know, it's important not to be dogmatic because you've got high slopes to low slopes, and in its neighbor, you've got the same Volnay, high slopes to low slopes. Volnay is generically characterized as the Chambol-Musigny of the south. It's the more floral, elegant, perfumed wine of red wine of the Côte de Beaune. But you know, within the complexity of the slopes, you know, you will find areas of Volnay that are much more robust, more structured than some areas of Pommard. So you can generalize, yeah, Volnay is elegant floral, Pommard is structured and powerful, but never take anything, particularly in Burgundy, as the full truth, the whole truth, and the only truth. It's just not like that. So I basically already described Volnay. There's not a lot to say. I realized that you also mentioned I should name some producers, and I haven't been doing that really, but maybe that's for another day. Otherwise, we'll be here until it's dark. But after Volnay, we reach Meursault. Boom, the color changes. It changes from red to white. There's a little area of land on the north of Meursault that you know it's part of, let's say, the joys or the cloud cuckoo land variety of rules and regulations that Burgundy like to have. So there's an area within Meursault, in the north of Meursault, that if you plant with Chardonnay, no surprise, it's called Meursault. But if you plant with Pinot, it's still called Volnay, even though it's over the border from Volnay and it's in Meursault. And this is the area that's called Saintonneau. And it's a famous Volnay area, Volnay-Saintonneau. It's an area that tends to have a little bit, on the hillside, you've got Saintonneau de Milieu, which basically runs to an area called Cailleret. I love Cailleret. It's about purity. It's about clarity. Saintonneau has a little bit more power, and certainly lower down the slope, it has deeper soil. There's more clay in the soil. It's darker soil, and Saintonneau it still has perfume, but it's a wine with a little bit more power as well. It's an interesting wine, and it's proper red wine country. There are a few people that still like to plant white, and why not? Maybe they already have enough red. Comte Lafont is one. Marquis d'Angeville is another, and he actually the Guillaume d'Angeville, he because it's planted in an area of Saint-Tenot, he actually writes Meursault Saint-Tenot on his label. There are not so many Meursault Saint-Tenot, but they normally just Meursault or Meursault Premier Cru. The one of Lafont, for instance, could be a Premier Cru, but he doesn't like the name that they have for that particular part of the vineyard. So he chooses an old name. It's over 100 years old, but it's not in the appellation contrôlée. And he would have a wine called Meursault Désiré than the one that's in the appellation contrôlée, which he finds boring and not so interesting. So, and he gets enough money for his wine anyway, so he's quite happy with Meursault Désiré. And that's next to Meursault Saint-Tenot. Meursault itself, no Grand Cru, but one of the Premier Crus there is usually priced a little bit higher, and you could describe as their quasi Grand Cru, and that would be Meursault Perrier. Now, Perrier basically, Perrier itself, it's stone, it's limestone, and Perrier usually designates an area that was once used as a quarry. So they were extracting stone to build the local houses in the village. And Meursault Perrier, the stone actually came out of this vineyard to build the spire of the church in Meursault itself. So there's lots of rules today about what you can and can't do in vineyards, like making holes and filling them with soil. Where did the soil come from? And, you lose your appellation contrôlée. And, 500 years ago, they just dug holes, they pulled out the rock, and then they filled it back with whatever soil they could find and planted some vines. And that's what we have today. But today you can't change things. But Meursault has plenty of Premier Crus, starting with things like Poruzo, Boucher, Goutte d'Or. Then you've got the fun again with like higher and lower parts of Genévrier, higher and lower parts of Les Charmes. But actually, you've got the higher and lower parts of Les Charmes, but even higher is Perrier above Les Charmes. And it's the games people play, because of obviously the higher part of Charmes has more energy and more freshness than let's call it the more generous parts lower down on the slope. But again, I'm generalizing. The market wants wines today not that are buttery and rich. They want precision, they want energy, they want direction. And Meursault is very happy to produce those wines and sell those wines, of course, today too. So that's Meursault. No Grand Crus, but it borders then, well, just above Meursault is another of these places that has, let's call them, an original set of rules. So it's called Blagny. It's high up on the hillside. It's just like a little hamlet of 5 or 6 houses with 2 or 3 domains. And it's still a reasonable area of land. But again, like this area of Meursault, the label depends on what's planted. So if it's planted with Pinot Noir, it's called Blagny, and it takes the name of some of the vineyards there. Nice wines, but I don't really ascribe a particular character to Red Blagny, to be honest, but some good wines, tasty wines, Premier Cru level wines as well. But again, I don't have really an archetypal character for Blagny in my head. But to the north of Blagny, if you plant with Chardonnay, it's called Meursault Blagny. And there are some lovely ones from there. The domain Comtesse de Chérice is which are based in Blagny, is making great wines today. Really top level, I would say. They're only now showing wines after their bottles, so I only just tasted the 20s last week, when generally I'm now tasting 2021s. But I remember the 2019s, and one of my top 5 white domains in the whole of Burgundy. Really top quality wines. But The southern side of Blagny, sorry, I digressed. The southern side of Blagny, this is Pouligny-Montrachet if you're planted with Chardonnay. But again, if you're planted with Pinot, it still takes the Blagny label. So it's one of
A
these like
trend here with these back and
those are the
forth.
two main areas that like that. The Meso Santino, Blagny. But then really we're talking about Pouligny-Montrachet. That's the neighbor of Meursault. Historically, you talked about tension in these wines, that they didn't have the same richness of Meursault. For generations, people wanted the richness of Meursault. Pouligny was effectively the poorer cousin of Meursault for many, many years. Now you could say the wines of Meursault are more Pouligny style from a generation ago than Pouligny is today. But Pouligny is about tension. It's about purity. It's about clarity. It's about also for many wines minerality. But Pouligny is also where the great Grand Crus are situated, and it comes back to my little discussion about place. Here it's 500 euros a bottle, here it's 800 euros a bottle, here it's 400 euros a bottle, it's 40 euros, and here it's not planted. That's effectively the border of Pouligny and Chassagne-Montrachet. They share some Grand Crus and some they have on their own. Chassagne have 100% of Criot Bâtard Montrachet, but they share Bâtard and Montrachet itself, but they don't have any of Chevalier or Bienvenue Bâtard, which are only within Pouligny-Montrachet. So there's always a political dimension to some of the
Gerrymandering.
distinctions in terms of terroir and the names of some of the wines. But really, Pouligny, we talk about the Grand Crus being prime location, mid-slope. Pouligny is one of the rare places where you've got some Grand Crus that are really on the flat of the land. They abut the hillside, but Bâtard Montrachet and Bienvenue Bâtard Montrachet, really they're on the flat of the land. Obviously, we're dealing with millennia of weather and rain bringing down the nice parts of the soil and the rocks down into this area, because abruptly both Bienvenue, which goes a little bit further into the flat, the plain of Pouligny-Montrachet, and Bâtard itself, they stop, and then there's no intermediate Premier Cru between those Grand Crus and the village. You move directly to village level wines. So we could say that's the border of where the good stuff got washed down the hillside. But Montrachet, it's what can one say about Montrachet? There are vintages occasionally these days where, compared to Chevalier, because I love the freshness and the tension of wine, I sometimes find Montrachet compared to Chevalier higher on the slope. I almost find Montrachet a little bit too much, a little bit too rich, almost oily in texture. I'm talking about young wines. Maybe I'd have a different perspective if I'm comparing 30-year-old bottles, but these days people don't have those opportunities so much because of the price of the wines, the availability of those wines. But some vintages, I have to say, a vintage like 2020, hands down, every Montrachet that I tasted, and I realize, I'm in a very privileged position with the domain visits that I make, and maybe it was 7 or 8 different Montrachets that I managed to taste with the 2020 village. Hands down, a greater wine than every other Grand Cru from that area. Bâtard or Chevalier, 2020 was a Montrachet vintage, and you just have to say bravo. And that's the terroir. but the climate, some vintages, it masks it a little bit. Maybe it resurfaces with time in bottle, but the climate today is very different to 20 years ago, 50 years ago, 200 years ago. And, the classification of Burgundy today reflects history, but somehow it can still fit with perfection today, even in 2020, which was a hot, dry year. 19 was a year with more alcohol, a little bit more richness in the wines, a little bit less precision. And that was a vintage where more often than not, I found the Chevalier more interesting, probably because it just had a hint more acidity, a hint less alcohol. And because of that, it had extra precision compared to a lot of the Montrachet wines. But in 2020, hands down, Montrachet. It's very easy to disparage something like Montrachet without regularly tasting, because it's expensive and you once had a bad one. You can say that about everyone. But some vintages you just have to take off your hat and say bravo. And 2020 would be an example of nothing compares to Montrachet from my perspective. Then you're already in Montrachet, because Montrachet is shared between the two villages. You already almost invisibly cross into the border with Chassagne-Montrachet. And let's call it the last major village of the Côte d'Or, and multiple Premier Crus, lots of great wine. I would say generally a little bit more supple than the directness, the intensity, the tension, that people like to use that word, of Pouligny-Montrachet, but no lack of shape and clarity and structure. It's almost the Clos Vougeot of white wine in some cases, but it's got a generosity that doesn't make the wine hard. Absolutely delicious. The one thing that really has changed a lot already in the time that I've been visiting in the last 25 years is the proportions of red and white wine that have been made in Chassagne-Montrachet, because 25 years ago there was much more red wine made than white wine. But coming back to, in the end, they're all farmers, and they've got higher yields from whites. They've got a couple of euros, or sometimes more than a couple of euros, more sales price for a bottle of white wine. There's been the whitening of Chassagne-Montrachet. Today, much less than 50% of the village is now red wine. Even areas that you would say traditionally, there's a darker soil, more iron in the soil, redder soil, a slightly different type or configuration of the stones, the limestone in the vineyards. You would say areas that are traditionally red wine areas are being pulled out and changed to white wine. But it's what the market wants. I know I'm not saying those are not great wines still, but they're hard to find. If you have the good fortune to find a bottle of Chassagne-Montrachet red from the 60s or 1970s, quite often it will say Chassagne-Montrachet. You think it's a village, but most of those reds in those days had a lot of Premier Cru wine in them as well, or maybe were 100% Premier Cru. You taste one of those wines today and you just think, it's not a lesser wine than a wine that could have come from Vaux-Romany. Of course, it's a lesser price today, but it's not a lesser wine. But Chassagne, red Chassagne, like Pommard, like Nuit Saint-Georges, had a reputation for being a structural wine, a tannic wine, and one that you should keep. But if you find one, really take advantage of finding that bottle, because you find some beautiful things. It's a shame that we're moving more in the direction of white wine from that perspective, because those opportunities are fewer and far between to taste such wines. But you know, Chassin, a super place. Don't disregard it as, or don't regard it as the poor cousin of Pouligny-Montrachet. It's most definitely not. It's actually in some ways more interesting because you've got more variety, more red and white. There's a tiny little amount of Pouligny-Montrachet red and an even tiny amount of Premier Cru red Pouligny-Montrachet. But there's quite a lot in Chassin, and it's worth investigating. Last village of the Côte d'Or to the south is Saint-Tenay. Historically, it wasn't always included in the Côte d'Or. You know, people would say it's 50 years ago, they would have said the Côte d'Or stopped in Chassin-Montrachet. But today, people tend to say Saint-Tenay. But if you stand high on the hill in Saint-Tenay, you can see why it's a borderline case. And that's because I mentioned, you know, the principal unifying factor of the Côte d'Or is this east-facing hillside. And you absolutely still have that in Saint-Tenay. But in Saint-Tenay, if you look to the east, this is where your view of the Jura, 150 kilometers away, is starting to become blocked by other hillsides. You no longer have the plain of the Saône River all the way to the Jura between you and the mountains. You now have other hillsides. You know, you're starting to have the hillside that forms part of the Côte Chalonnaise with Bouzeron on the Saint-Tenay side and Rouy on the other side of that hillside. You know, there's some blockage. There's some change of the topography of the place. And so also because you're now starting to have more, some north-facing areas, you're also starting to have a more mixed agriculture. You can find cows in fields next to vineyards, or you can find maize or barley or corn being grown. And that's something that carries through then into the Côte Chalonnaise and the Mâconnais as well. It's slightly more mixed. It's not just the monoculture of the vines in the east-facing hillside that you have in the Côte d'Or today. And of course, that's also a modern construct, because 50 years ago, a family, let's say two generations, a family in a big farmhouse in Burgundy, they couldn't live only on the income from making and selling wine. Or more often than not, just selling the grapes, because they were sold to people like Bichot or Bouchard or Jadot, you know, some of the big maisons who had the ability to crush the grapes and make the wine. Not everybody could afford the equipment, because the margins making grapes were not significantly higher than, as I say, planting corn or having pigs or cows. So that was the reality in Burgundy 50 years ago. You know, it's only since the 1960s that most of the gaps in the Côte d'Or have slowly been filled with vines. So that's the Côte d'Or in,
you know what? I think
only half an hour instead of probably 10 minutes.
No, but you know what? This was so informative. And I think we will have to leave the Côte Chalonnaise and the Mâconnais for another day, and Beaujolais and Chablis. We've got lots more to cover. I just have a quick lightning round for you before we wrap up.
Okay, let's do it.
First, what would you say are your top three to five vintages for red and white across the Côte d'Or?
Well, let's start with white. Do you want to clarify that? Are we talking the last 10 years, or are we talking the last 25 years?
Let's say the last 25, last 30, just the best vintages of the last
30.
Or let's go big. Because you did mention 1962 was a good one.
It's quite a good one. So the white wine, recent vintage 2020 is a great one. 2014 is also a great one, but one that still needs some patience. And of course, I'm talking from my perspective of someone who likes some acidity, some energy, some clarity and direction in the wines. I loved the 2007s when they first came out. Some of the Village were a little bit screechy, maybe a little bit too much acidity, but Premier Cru, Grand Cru, wow, great, great wines. The problem with 2007 was it was really in the time of when the issue of oxidized wine started coming to the fore, and you know, middle-aged, let's say 10 plus years old white wine is, it's like tossing a coin. You don't know whether you're going to have a good one. It's the base wine that's the issue today. It's more easily oxidizable than was once the case. So if you seal with cork, you have good corks and less good corks in terms of oxygen transport in the corks, the standard deviation, the bell curve. The average is in the middle. The least oxygen transport is on one side and the most oxygen transport is on the other side. You have everything. It's an average. And you have corks with very low oxygen transport, and all those wines are tip-top condition, not a problem. The average wine is tending to fall over, and those corks that have a higher than average oxygen transportation level, most of those wines have been dead for a long time. I actually, with the 2012 vintage was the last vintage that I bought white wine to cellar that was sealed with natural cork. A lot of people will be shocked, but for me, I put too much great wine down the sink because it was completely oxidized, and I don't like the taste and smell of oxidation. If I did, I'd be drinking lots of wine from the Jura. I'd be drinking lots of wine from Spain, from Sherry, Jerez, and these places, but I don't because it's not my thing. So something that came onto the market in the early 2000s are the amalgam corks. The most famous seller is Diam, as the French would say, or Diam, as the Brits and the Americans might say. And it's a cork amalgam that, initially was developed against corked wine. So it goes through a process where it uses effectively a gas at a certain pressure and temperature that it acts like a liquid, or halfway between a gas and a liquid, and it dissolves the impurities in the cork. It makes them soluble and it takes them away. And then what's more interesting for oxidized wine is all these cork particles are bonded back together with a type of glue. It's an industrial process, and instead of having a bell curve that's like this in terms of oxygen permeabilities, boom, it's like this. It's very easy to measure. It's very consistent, as all industrial processes should be, and because of that, it works really well. It is. I hesitate to call it a solution to oxidized wine because, the base problem with the base wine still exists. But it seems to be, for at least wines of 15 years old, because we haven't had this type of seal for much longer than that, it seems the perfect sticking plaster. I'll call it that. Mm. It's a solution, but it's not a solution to the oxidizable property of the wine today compared to 30 years ago, and that's quite a nebulous discussion of why it might have changed, but that's my understanding of the situation, and empirically it works for me today like that. I haven't thrown a wine away since the 2012 vintage.
Well, that's good. I think
I'm still throwing away wines from 2011, 2010, 2009. Too many losses, but going back to it, for me, 2020, 2014, 2007 are really standout vintages in let's say the last 15 years or so. And going any further back than that's just problematic because you've got an 80% chance that the wine is corked. Sorry, not corked, is oxidized. That's a shame. Reds. Ooh, that's interesting. So so many differences in the last 25 years. We go from what I would call the classic vintages. You know, the first vintages that I started buying from the shelf in wine shops would be 92, 93, 94. The first vintages I bought en primeur in case slots were 96. 99 is great. 2002 is delicious. 2010 is equally delicious. In between, you've got 2005, which is a great vintage, but a lot of the wines are still not quite ready. You've got 2012, a vintage of beautiful clarity, but wines that they suddenly went tight and are only now starting to show themselves a little bit, only now just starting to open up a little bit. 15, 16, 17. 17 were delicious. 18 is okay. We're in a period now. We have a lot of extra ripeness, but I would say 19. Oh, wow, maybe the Pinot Noir vines are starting to become accustomed and getting used to vintages of higher temperatures, less rainfall, drier vintages. You know, 2019, 2020 were vintages where the vines would have really suffered because it's not ridiculous to compare them with 2003. And 2003, the red wines had no acidity. Those that live today are basically living on their structure, I would say. You wouldn't have said they were balanced wines at the time, but some are remaining, have plateaued and they're staying very consistent. They're hardly maturing, but they're still actually relatively young fruit. That's the issue with modern vintages today. We don't know how long you have to wait for that fruit to slowly come into maturity as we would understand it from older vintages. But for me, slowly working back, 2019, a great red vintage for both Côte de Beaune and Côte de Nuits. In general, I prefer it to 2020 because 19 is certainly better in the Côte de Beaune. And you have some better wines in the Côte de Nuits in 2020, but in general, not everything. So 2019, 2005, great vintage. It seemed to have everything in its youth, and then a lot of the wines just went very tight. Some have always been great, some are still not open, but I consider a great vintage. 99 is like 2005, where I bought far too much wine. But
well, if you have some you're trying to get rid of, you have a friend in me.
Let's say I'm still harvesting those wines and enjoying them a lot now. But 2010, 2002, beautiful vintages either side of 2005. But I would say, 19, 2005, and 99. And those are three very different styles of vintages, but great. And importantly, for a great vintage, the measure of a great vintage for me is not just a few wines where I just think, oh, wow. It's where everyone had the chance, the shot at making some great wines. And really, there are those three vintages are certainly at the good addresses, wines where you can't lose. 1905 and 99, I would say, are my top three vintages in the last 20 years.
Good tips. Well, I'm sure all of our listeners are going to go out and try to get their hands on some of those. But Bill, I think we have to wrap up, but this was fantastic. Okay. This was such a wonderful survey of Burgundy. And we are absolutely going to get back together again and talk
Let's do
about
it.
Chablis, Beaujolais, maybe deep dive into some of these villages. So thank you so much
Okay.
for your time. And
Pleasure.
we'll hopefully see you again soon.
Until next time.